The flashlight beam sliced through the dense pine darkness, blinding and immediate. 1 second, I was wrapped in the suffocating comfort of the night, and the next, I was exposed. The smell of damp earth mixed with the sharp taste of adrenaline in my throat, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Then she stepped forward, a silhouette of absolute authority, the glint of a badge, heavy boots crunching on needles. She didn't ask for a permit. She looked right through me and asked, "You're miles off the trail. What did you leave behind?" The question hung in the cold air, suspending me between the safety of the past and the danger of the present. To answer her, I would have to explain the noise. Not the wind in the trees, but the sterile electric hum of the 42nd floor. For 10 years, my life had been measured in quarterly returns and the blue light of a monitor. I was a ghost in a tailored suit, haunting my own life. The burnout wasn't a crash. It was a slow, grinding erosion. It was the moment during a Zoom call when I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt the sun on my skin without a window between us. It was the shaking in my hands that 3 glasses of expensive wine couldn't steady. The city was a cage of glass and steel, and I had locked myself inside it, convinced that the suffocation was just the price of success. So I drove. I drove until the city was a smudge in the rearview mirror, until the GPS signal died and the paved roads turned to gravel. I wasn't looking for a hike. I was looking for silence. But the forest isn't silent. It's deafeningly alive. I'd parked the car at a trailhead that looked abandoned and just started walking. The air here was different, thinner, cleaner, smelling of pine resin and decay. At first, the rhythm of my boots on the dirt felt like a victory. I was moving. I was in control. But the woods have a way of stripping you down. The light shifted first. The golden hour didn't glow here. It just vanished behind the ridge, plunging the temperature 20 degrees in 20 minutes. The cold didn't care about my title. It didn't care about my portfolio or my reputation. It just seeped into my bones, indifferent and brutal. That's when I noticed the trail markers were gone. I'd been so focused on putting distance between myself and the world that I hadn't watched where my feet were taking me. Panic is a cold thing. It starts in the stomach and climbs up the throat. In the city, panic is a missed deadline or a PR crisis, things you can solve with a phone call or a strategy meeting. Out here, panic was the realization that the trees all looked the same. The shadows lengthened, stretching out like fingers, distorting the landscape. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest floor was a chaotic map of roots and needles that refused to give up its secrets. My VP title offered no protection against the elements. My negotiation skills meant nothing to a Douglas fir. I sat on a mossy log, my breathing ragged. The silence I had craved was now heavy, pressing in on my eardrums. It wasn't peaceful. It was predatory. I realized then that the chaos of the office was safe because it was man-made. We built the walls. We wrote the rules. Here, I was an intruder. The wind picked up, rustling the canopy above, sounding like 1,000 whispering voices. I checked my phone for the 100th time. No signal. Just a black screen reflecting my own terrified face. The darkness wasn't just falling. It was rising from the ground up, swallowing the trunks, then the branches, then the sky. I was truly, terrifyingly alone. The forest had stripped away the executive, the achiever, the woman who had it all together, leaving only a shivering body in the dark. And with the shadows came the realization that I wasn't just lost on a map. I was lost in a way that no compass could fix. She lowered the flashlight, but the intensity of her gaze didn't dim. It wasn't the aggressive stare of a police officer looking for a violation. It was the clinical, stripping assessment of someone who deals with survival as a baseline. She stepped closer, her boots sinking silently into the pine needles, and I finally saw her clearly. She was tall, solid in a way the city never allowed people to be. Her uniform was practical, khaki and forest green, but on her, it looked like armor. A utility belt hung low on her hips, heavy with tools I couldn't name, and her hands, currently resting near her waist, were weather-beaten and capable. No manicures, no soft edges, just raw capability wrapped in authority. "I asked you a question," she said. Her voice was a low rumble, dropping an octave below the wind, vibrating in the space between us. It wasn't a shout. It was a command that bypassed my brain and went straight to my nervous system. "You're not dressed for this drop. Hypothermia sets in faster than you think out here." She wasn't looking at my lack of a permit. She was reading the tremors in my hands, the shallow rise and fall of my chest, the way my pupils must have been blown wide with panic. In the boardroom, I knew how to posture. I knew how to wear the mask of the competent executive VP who had the Q3 strategy under control. But here, under the canopy of ancient trees and the scrutiny of those storm-gray eyes, my corporate armor dissolved. She was reading the exhaustion etched into my posture, the spiritual fatigue that was heavier than the cold. "I got turned around," I managed to say, though my voice sounded thin and brittle, like dry leaves snapping. "The markers, I lost them." "You didn't lose them," she corrected, her tone devoid of judgment but heavy with truth. She took another step, invading my personal space with a deliberation that made my breath hitch. "You walked away from them." She reached out then. I flinched, a reflex born of too much caffeine and too much stress, but she didn't pull back. She stripped off a heavy leather glove, revealing a hand that was warm and calloused. She pressed the back of her fingers against my cheek, then slid them down to the side of my neck to check my pulse. The contact was electric. It wasn't just the shock of heat against my frozen skin. It was the sudden, grounding reality of another human being anchoring me to the earth. The smell of her hit me. Pine resin, damp wool, and something sharper, like ozone before a storm. "Your heart is racing," she murmured, her eyes locking onto mine, unflinching. She wasn't just checking my vitals. She was mapping the panic. "You're running on fumes. When was the last time you ate? Drank water?" "I don't know," I whispered. The proximity was intoxicating. The heat radiating from her uniform felt like a physical weight, pressing against the cold that had settled in my marrow. I wanted to lean into her. I wanted to collapse against that solid capability and let her carry the weight I'd been dragging around for a decade. "You didn't just get lost, did you?" She withdrew her hand, but the ghost of her touch lingered on my skin, burning. "People who get lost look for the path. You were sitting on that log waiting for the dark." The truth of it shattered the last of my defenses. I could have lied. I could have made up a story about a dead phone or a wrong turn. But the way she looked at me, candid, serious, seeing right through the VP title to the terrified woman underneath, demanded honesty. I stopped looking, I confessed, the words tumbling out before I could check them. I saw the trail marker back at the ridge. I saw it, and I turned the other way. Because if I found the path, I'd have to go back. And I can't go back. I can't do it anymore. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't empty. She studied me, her gray eyes darkening as she processed the admission. She didn't reach for her radio. She didn't pull out a citation book. She just nodded, a slow, appraising movement that shifted the entire dynamic between us. I wasn't a trespasser anymore. I was something else, something she recognized. "We're not going back to the trailhead," she said, her voice softer now, stripping away the enforcement but keeping the command. My truck is on the service road a half-mile east. You're coming with me. It wasn't a request. But for the first time in years, following an order didn't feel like a defeat. It felt like an invitation to be saved. The cab of the truck was a world unto itself. It smelled of pine resin, old coffee, and worn leather, a scent that felt ancient and capable. The heater rattled to life, blasting hot air against my frozen knees, and the sudden warmth made my head swim. I watched Rowan's hands on the steering wheel. They were steady, relaxed at 10 and 2, guiding the heavy vehicle over the rutted service road with an ease that bordered on arrogance. The dashboard lights cast a green glow across her profile, highlighting the sharp line of her jaw and the focus in her eyes. We didn't speak. The silence wasn't the empty, awkward void of an elevator ride with a stranger. It was thick, charged, coiled tight like a spring. Every time the truck lurched over a pothole, our shoulders brushed. The contact was brief, a friction of fabric against fabric, but my skin pricked with awareness each time. I found myself waiting for the bumps, leaning imperceptibly toward the center console, drawn into her orbit by a gravity I couldn't name. She glanced at me once, her eyes catching the dashboard light, and for a second, the air left the cab. She didn't check the road, she checked me, assessing my shivering, my stare, my presence in her passenger seat. The station wasn't a sterile government outpost. It was a cabin of rough-hewn logs and stone, solid and unpretentious, crouching at the base of the mountain. She killed the engine, and the absence of the rumble made my ears ring. "Inside," she said, "before the rain starts." I followed her, my legs stiff, feeling like an intruder entering a sanctuary. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of wood smoke and sage. It was cluttered but orderly, maps pinned to the walls, a radio humming low static in the corner, a cast iron stove radiating heat. This was her domain. Every object here had a purpose. Nothing was decorative. She pointed me to a worn armchair near the stove. "Sit." I sat. I watched her move around the small kitchenette with an economy of motion. No wasted energy, just fluid, deliberate actions. She filled a kettle, lit a burner, pulled a heavy wool blanket from a chest. She didn't toss the blanket to me. She unfolded it and draped it over my shoulders, her hands lingering for a fraction of a second too long on the wool near my neck. The weight of it was grounding. "Drink this," she said a moment later, pressing a ceramic mug into my hands. It was tea, dark, strong, smelling of bergamot. Our fingers brushed against the warm ceramic. The contact was prolonged this time. She didn't pull away immediately. Her skin was rough against my smooth, lotion-softened hands, a contrast that sent a jolt straight down my spine. I looked up at her, and the distance between us felt non-existent. I could see the flecks of gold in her gray eyes, the small scar above her left eyebrow. The professional distance was dissolving, replaced by a humidity that had nothing to do with the weather. "Why here?" she asked, leaning back against the edge of her desk, crossing her arms. It wasn't an interrogation anymore. It was curiosity. "You're not a hiker. Why did you drive 4 hours to get lost in my woods?" I took a sip of the tea, the heat spreading through my chest. "I didn't think I was coming to get lost," I admitted, my voice dropping to match the low hum of the room. "I thought I was coming to find quiet. But the quiet is too loud." "The quiet is only loud when you're screaming on the inside," she said. It wasn't a platitude. It was a diagnosis. She tilted her head, studying me. "You're burnt out. I see it every season. High-performance engines that run until they seize up. You think the trees will fix it because they don't ask for quarterly reports." "Do they?" I asked. "No," she said, her voice dropping, intimate and low. "The trees don't care about you. That's the point. You come here to remember that you're small, that your deadlines don't matter to the mountain. I looked at her, really looked at her. She wasn't offering me a safety lecture. She was mapping my emotional landscape with the same precision she used on the topographic maps on the wall. She saw the cracks in the foundation. I expected a ticket, I whispered. I don't write tickets for souls in crisis, she said. And the way her gaze lingered on my mouth made the room spin. I just make sure they don't freeze before they figure out what they really left behind. I should have driven away the moment the sun came up. The logical, career-driven part of my brain, the part that had secured the VP title, was screaming at me to get back to the city, to the emails piling up like snowdrifts in my inbox. But when I reached the edge of the park, where the asphalt smoothed out and the cell service returned with a relentless barrage of notifications, I physically couldn't do it. My hands froze on the wheel. The thought of the skyline, the noise, the endless demands on my time felt like a physical weight crushing my chest. So I made a U-turn. I didn't go back to the trailhead, but I didn't leave either. I booked a cabin at the lodge on the perimeter of the park for a week. A week turned into 2. I told my firm I was taking a medical leave. I told myself I was healing. But the truth was, I was haunting the edges of her life, unable to sever the tether she had unknowingly attached to me. I became a student of her routine. My days fell into a rhythm dictated not by meetings, but by the flash of her green truck passing the lodge. I would sit on my porch with a book I wasn't reading, waiting for a glimpse of her. It was pathetic, maybe. Or maybe it was just the first time in my life I was paying attention to something that couldn't be quantified on a spreadsheet. I watched her work from a distance. I saw her clearing fallen timber from the storm, wielding a chainsaw with a casual, terrifying competence. I watched her handle tourists, city people like I used to be, with a patience that was firm but absolute. There was something intoxicating about watching her work. She could calm a spooked horse with a touch, or read the weather in the clouds before the sky even turned. It was physical. It was real. And it was making it impossible for me to sleep. She knew I was there. Our encounters weren't accidental, though we both pretended they were. She would drive by my campsite, slowing the truck just enough to catch my eye, a silent check-in that felt like a caress. "Still here?" her look would say. "Still here," mine would answer. The tension between us wasn't spoken. It was a frequency we were both tuned into. One afternoon, she found me struggling with a paper map at one of the picnic tables near the station. I had given up on the GPS. I wanted to understand the land the way she did. "You're holding it upside down," she said. I hadn't heard her approach. She moved with the silent grace of a predator. Or a protector. I started to fold the map, embarrassed, but she stopped me. "Don't. Let me show you." She moved around the table to stand beside me. She didn't sit. She leaned over my shoulder, placing both hands on the table, effectively caging me between her arms. I could feel the heat radiating from her body, a solid wall of warmth against my back. She smelled of wood smoke, damp earth, and that sharp, clean scent of ozone. It was overwhelming. My breath hitched, and I prayed she wouldn't notice. But she was a ranger. She noticed everything. "These lines," she said, her voice dropping that dangerous octave, vibrating right near my ear. She reached out, her finger tracing the squiggly contours on the paper. Her arm brushed against my shoulder, a friction that sent a shockwave straight to my core. "They represent elevation. When they're close together, the climb is steep. When they spread out, the ground levels." I tried to focus on the paper. I really did. But her hand was so close to mine, her weathered fingers moving with deliberate slowness across the map. She wasn't just teaching me navigation. She was teaching me how to be near her. She shifted her weight, leaning closer, and her chest brushed against my back. It was a fleeting contact, barely there, but it felt like a brand.
"You have to orient yourself to the north," she murmured. Her breath ghosted against the sensitive skin of my neck, and my hands trembled on the table. "If you don't know where north is, you'll walk in circles forever."
"I think I've been walking in circles for a long time," I whispered, turning my head slightly.
She didn't pull back.
She was close enough that I could see the individual lashes framing those storm gray eyes, close enough to count the beats of the pulse in her throat. The map lay forgotten beneath our hands. The lesson had shifted. She wasn't talking about the woods anymore. "Then stop walking," she said, her gaze dropping to my lips for a fraction of a second before snapping back to my eyes. "Find your landmark and hold on to it." The map showed the topography of the land, the peaks, the valleys, the dangerous drops. But as she stood there, encompassing me in her space, I realized I was getting lost in the topography of her. And for the first time, I didn't want to be found. I wanted to stay right here, in the dangerous electric space between the contour lines. The sky didn't just darken, it bruised. That's the only way to describe the color that bled across the horizon, a deep, swollen purple that looked painful to touch. I was 3 miles up the ridge trail, feeling proud of my navigation, checking my map against the landmarks just like she'd taught me. But the mountains have a way of reminding you that your preparation means nothing to their temperament. The pressure dropped so fast my ears popped, a physical sensation that felt like the air itself was being sucked out of the valley. Then the wind hit. It wasn't a gust, it was a wall. It slammed into the pines, bending them at impossible angles, the sound like a freight train screaming through the canopy. I turned back, adrenaline spiking. But the storm moved with a speed that defied logic. The first drops of rain were heavy and cold, hitting my skin like lead shot. Within seconds, the trail was a river of mud. Visibility dropped to 0. I was blind, deafened by the roar of the wind, and for a moment, that old, familiar panic clawed at my throat. I stumbled, my boots sliding on slick rock, and I braced for the fall. But I never hit the ground. A hand clamped around my upper arm, strong enough to leave a bruise. I didn't even have to look to know who it was. Rowan didn't emerge from the trees. She materialized from the storm itself, an extension of the chaos. She was shouting something, but the wind tore the words away. She didn't repeat herself. She just yanked me forward, her grip unyielding, pulling me off the main trail and toward a steep, narrow path I hadn't even seen. We scrambled up the incline, mud slicking our boots, the rain coming down in sheets so thick I could barely breathe. Above us, a structure loomed in the gray washout, a fire lookout tower, perched on stilts like a spider, its glass eyes staring blindly into the gale. We hit the stairs, the metal grating clanging under our frantic footsteps. Rowan was behind me, her hand on the small of my back, a solid pressure urging me upward, faster, faster. We reached the catwalk, the wind threatening to peel us off the mountain, and she shoved the heavy door open. We tumbled inside, and she slammed it shut, throwing the deadbolt. The silence was sudden and shocking. The roar of the storm was instantly muffled to a dull, rhythmic hammering against the glass. We were trapped in a 10 by 10 glass box suspended in the sky, the world outside reduced to a blur of gray violence. I was gasping for air, my chest heaving, water pooling at my feet. I looked at Rowan. She was leaning against the door, chest rising and falling, her hat gone, her hair plastered to her forehead in dark, wet strands. Water dripped from her nose, her chin, soaking into the collar of her uniform. She looked wild. Her hat was gone, her hair plastered to her forehead in dark, wet strands. "You're soaking wet," she said. Her voice was rough, cutting through the heavy air of the small room. She pushed off the door and moved to the center of the room, where a small propane heater sat. She cranked it to life, the hiss of gas followed by the click of ignition, a blue flame blooming in the gloom. "I'm fine,"
I lied, my teeth chattering so hard the words fractured.
You're not fine. You're shivering. She turned to me, her eyes sweeping over my form with that terrifying clinical precision. My clothes were clinging to me, a second skin of cold, wet fabric that sapped the heat from my body. Get them off.
The command hung in the air, heavier than the humidity. It wasn't a sexual request, it was a survival directive. But in the tiny glass-walled room, with the storm raging inches away and the heat beginning to radiate from the stove, it felt like both.
Rowan, I started, but my voice failed me. Hypothermia doesn't care about your modesty, Melanie. Wet cotton kills. Take it off. I have a spare blanket in the locker. She turned her back to me, rummaging through a metal footlocker at the base of the bed. It was a gesture of privacy, a professional courtesy, but it only heightened the intimacy. The sound of her moving things around, the hiss of the heater, the hammering rain, it all amplified the sound of my own zipper. I peeled off my jacket. My hands were shaking, fumbling with the wet denim of my jeans. The air in the tower was warming up, but I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. I stripped down to my base layers, a thin camisole and briefs that felt woefully inadequate against the sudden charge in the room. Here, Rowan turned back, holding a thick wool blanket. She stopped. Her eyes didn't dart away. They held mine, then traveled down, taking in the curve of my waist, the rise and fall of my chest, the way the damp silk clung to my skin. It wasn't a lecherous look. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition of the woman beneath the executive armor. The air between us thickened, coiled tight with an electricity that rivaled the lightning flashing outside. She stepped closer, invading my space, and wrapped the blanket around my shoulders. She didn't let go of the edges. She pulled them tight, her knuckles grazing the bare skin of my collarbone. Her hands were warm, calloused, and rough. The contrast made my breath hitch. She was close enough that I could smell the rain on her skin, the damp wool of her uniform, and beneath it all, the warm musk scent of her. Better? She asked, her voice dropping that octave again, vibrating through the wool and straight into my bones. Warmer, I whispered. Good. She didn't step back. We stood there, the storm raging against the glass, trapped in our transparent cage. The survival mode was fading, replaced by something heavier, something dangerous. The storm was outside, but the real pull was right here, in the silence between us. The storm outside erased the world. There were no mountains, no trees, no trail markers, just a relentless, hammering darkness pressing against the glass walls of our cage. But inside, the world had shrunk to a 10 by 10 square, illuminated by the golden hiss of a propane lantern. The light was soft, throwing long, dancing shadows against the ceiling, softening the hard angles of the equipment and the rigid lines of Rowan's jaw. She had shed her wet uniform shirt, leaving her in a gray thermal Henley that clung to her shoulders. It was a small change, but it felt monumental. The badge was gone. The heavy utility belt sat on the floor, a discarded symbol of the authority that usually defined her. She wasn't the ranger now. She was just Rowan. She sat on the floor with her back against the metal footlocker, legs stretched out, watching the blue flame of the heater with a contemplative silence that felt louder than the wind. I sat opposite her, wrapped in the scratchy wool blanket, clutching a tin cup of instant coffee she'd brewed on the camp stove. It tasted metallic and bitter, but the heat of it was the only thing keeping my teeth from chattering. The silence between us was different now. Not empty, but filled with the kind of intimacy that only exists in small spaces during disasters. We were two survivors in a lifeboat, drifting in a sea of rain. You never asked, Rowan said, her voice low, blending with the rhythm of the storm. She didn't look at me. She kept her eyes on the heater. You never asked why I'm out here. Most people do. They want to know what tragedy drove the woman to the woods.
I figured you just liked the quiet, I murmured, pulling the blanket tighter, conscious of my bare legs underneath.
I hate the quiet, she admitted, turning her head to look at me. The lantern light caught the gold flecks in her irises, making them burn. The quiet is where the ghosts live. I came here because the noise of the forest is honest. The wind doesn't lie to you. The cold doesn't pretend to be your friend. In the city, in the life I had before, everyone was smiling while they held the knife. It was a revelation that mirrored my own, a dark reflection of the burnout that had driven me to her gate. She shifted, leaning forward slightly, her elbows resting on her knees. The movement brought her closer, shrinking the distance between us until I could smell the coffee on her breath and the damp wool of her clothes. "You think you're weak," she stated. It wasn't a question. "I watched you on the trail. I watched you in the station. You carry yourself like someone who failed." "I did fail," I whispered. "I walked away from everything I built." "No." Rowan shook her head slowly. She reached out, her hand hovering for a second before landing on my knee. The blanket was between us, but I felt the heat of her palm as if I were naked. Breaking is easy. Staying in a life that destroys you? That's easy because it's familiar. Walking away? Cutting the tether when you're terrified of the fall? That's not failure, Melanie. That's survival. Her thumb brushed back and forth against the wool, a rhythmic, hypnotic motion that sent tremors up my thigh. "I've seen panic out here," she continued, her voice dropping to that dangerous, sultry register that vibrated in my chest. "I've seen grown men crumble when the sun goes down. But you? You sat on that log and you waited. You looked the dark in the eye and you didn't blink. You are unflinching." The word hung in the air, a compliment that felt like a caress. Unflinching. No one had ever called me that. They called me efficient, productive, capable. But unflinching felt physical. It felt like she was seeing the steel spine I thought I had lost. She moved then, shifting from a sitting position to her knees, closing the gap until she was looming over me. The air thickened, coiled tight with an electricity that had nothing to do with the lightning. She reached up, her hand leaving my knee to brush a wet strand of hair from my forehead. Her fingers were rough, calloused maps of her work, but her touch was agonizingly gentle. She let her hand linger on the side of my neck, her thumb resting on my pulse point. "You're still cold," she whispered. Her eyes dropped to my lips, then back up to my eyes, dark with an intent that stopped my heart. "I'm warmer than I was," I breathed. My body was betraying me, leaning into her hand, craving the friction, the contact, the solid reality of her. The silence stretched, heavy with want. The storm raged outside, pounding against the glass. But in here, everything was still. Her face was inches from mine. I could see the small pores of her skin, the way her pupils dilated, swallowing the gray. The magnetic pull was undeniable, a physical force dragging me toward her. I wanted her to close the distance. I wanted to taste the rain on her skin, but she didn't. She held the moment, suspending us in the delicious, agonizing tension of the almost. "Sleep," she murmured, pulling her hand away slowly, leaving my skin burning in the absence of her touch. "The storm will break by morning." She moved back to her side of the small room, laying out a sleeping bag on the hard floor. We lay down in the dark, the lantern extinguished, the only light coming from the occasional flash of lightning. We were close enough to share the same air, close enough that I could hear the rhythm of her breathing change as she drifted off. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the rain and the heavy, loaded silence. my body humming with the memory of her hand on my neck. Morning light in a glass tower isn't gentle. It is an interrogation. It flooded the small room, bleaching out the shadows where we had hidden the night before, exposing everything. I woke up stiff, the wool blanket tangled around my legs, the smell of ozone replaced by the stale, metallic scent of dried rain and propane. Rowan was already up. Of course she was. She was standing by the windows, scanning the horizon with binoculars, her uniform shirt back on, buttoned to the throat. The intimacy of the thermal Henley was gone. The wildness of the storm was gone. In the harsh clarity of 6 a.m, the magic felt fragile, like a dream dissipating upon waking. Then, the vibration started. It wasn't a subtle hum. It was a violent buzzing against the metal floor where my jacket lay in a heap. My phone. For 2 weeks, it had been a dead brick, a useless artifact of a former life. But the storm must have cleared the atmospheric interference, or maybe the wind had just blown the signal in our direction. Ping, ping, ping. The sound was relentless, a machine gun fire of digital demands. I froze. My first instinct wasn't relief. It was nausea. It was a physical recoil, a tightening in my chest that tasted like bile. I reached for it. It was muscle memory, a Pavlovian response drilled into me by a decade of being on call. The screen lit up, blindingly bright. 47 new emails, 12 missed calls. Urgent. Crisis. Where are you? The names on the screen weren't just people. They were anchors dragging me back to the bottom of the ocean. I felt my shoulders hunch, my jaw set. I tapped a reply before I even realized what I was doing, my thumbs moving with a frantic, practiced speed. Handling it. We'll call in an hour. The lie tasted like ash. I didn't hear Rowan move, but I felt the temperature in the room drop. I looked up. She had lowered the binoculars. She was watching me, her face unreadable, her eyes flat. The warmth from the night before, the unflinching compliment, the hand on my neck, it was all walled off behind a layer of professional indifference. She saw the phone in my hand. She saw the way I was hunched over the glow, ignoring the sunrise she had probably wanted to show me. "Signal is back," she said. Her voice was dry, stripped of the sultry cadence that had lulled me to sleep. "We should head down. The service road will be muddy, but passable." She didn't offer me coffee. She didn't ask if I was okay. She picked up her hat, the Stetson with the stiff brim, and settled it on her head. It was a physical barrier, a shield. The ranger was back. The woman who had almost kissed me was gone, retreated into the safety of protocol, because I had retreated into the safety of my inbox. The descent from the tower was mechanical. My boots clanged on the metal stairs, a hollow, lonely sound. The drive back to the lodge was excruciating. The silence in the truck wasn't charged anymore. It was heavy, suffocating, filled with the things we weren't saying. I sat with my phone clutched in my hand like a weapon, the screen dark but the threat of it pulsing against my palm. I wanted to say something. I wanted to tell her that the emails meant nothing, that I didn't want to go back. But the words stuck in my throat. I felt like a fraud. How could I claim to be unflinching when a few notifications had sent me scrambling back to my cage? She pulled up to the lodge. The engine idled, a rough vibration that rattled my teeth. She didn't look at me. She kept her hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead at the wet asphalt. "Be safe, Melanie," she said. It was a dismissal. "Rowan," I started. "Go," she cut me off. Soft but final. "You have calls to make." I opened the door and stepped out into the cold morning air. The paved road beneath my boots felt hard and unforgiving, a sentence leading me back to a life that no longer fit my skin. The room at the lodge was perfect. It had high thread count sheets, climate control set to a steady 70 degrees, and a view of the trees that felt distant and safe, like a screensaver on a monitor. It was expensive. It was comfortable. It was dead. I stood in the center of the room, my suitcase open on the bed like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. I moved mechanically, folding silk blouses and tailored slacks, placing them into the dark interior of the bag. The woman who wore them was waiting for me back in the city, ready to slip back into my skin the moment I crossed the county line into cell service range. I picked up a blazer, black, severe, structured. It felt like holding a shackle. I remembered buying it. I remembered the rush of feeling powerful, of walking into a negotiation and knowing I was the sharpest thing in the room. But holding it now, with the phantom sensation of wet wool and Rowan's rough hands still lingering on my skin, the blazer just felt heavy. It felt like a costume for a play I had forgotten the lines to. It smelled of dry cleaning chemicals and stale air, a sharp contrast to the scent of ozone and pine that seemed permanently etched into my pores. My phone sat on the nightstand, buzzing intermittently. The crisis was managed. The team was waiting. The flight was booked. It was all so easy. The path back was paved, lit, and waiting. All I had to do was zip the bag, get in the car, and drive. I would be back in time for the Monday morning briefing. I would sit at the head of the table. I would drink the expensive coffee. And I would slowly, quietly suffocate. I packed my toiletries. The expensive face cream, the retinol, the things designed to hide the exhaustion. I caught my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back wasn't the VP. Her hair was a mess, tangled from the storm. Her skin was windburned. Her eyes looked awake. For the first time in 10 years, the eyes in the mirror weren't glassy with fatigue. They were hungry, unflinching. The word echoed in the silence of the room, louder than the HVAC system. I closed my eyes, and I was back in the tower. I could feel the damp cold, the smell of propane, the overwhelming magnetic pull of Rowan's body inches from mine. I felt the ghost of her thumb on my pulse point. She hadn't seen a VP. She hadn't seen a failure. She had seen me. And she had called me unflinching. If I left now, I was flinching. I was blinking. I was looking the dark in the eye and running away because the light was too revealing. I looked at the suitcase. It was full. My life, neatly folded and compressed. I reached out and grabbed the zipper. The metal was cold. I pulled it shut. The sound was a harsh zip that finalized everything. I stood there, hand on the bag, staring at the closed lid. This was it. The safe choice. The smart choice. The choice that would kill me by degrees. My heart started hammering, that familiar panic rising. But this time, it wasn't fear of the woods. It was fear of the elevator. Fear of the silence in my penthouse. Fear of never feeling a hand as rough and gentle as Rowan's ever again. I thought about the heat radiating from her uniform. I thought about the way she didn't kiss me. Not because she didn't want to. God, the air had been thick enough to choke on. But because she respected me too much to do it when I was weak. I wasn't weak now. I grabbed the zipper again. My hand was shaking, not from cold, but from the sheer, terrifying adrenaline of what I was about to do. I didn't just unzip the bag. I ripped it open. I grabbed the black blazer and threw it on the floor. Then the silk blouses, the slacks. I tore the costume apart, scattering the pieces of the executive VP across the generic hotel carpet. I wasn't packing to leave. I was unpacking to stay. I wasn't going back to the noise. I was choosing the thunder. I stood amidst the wreckage of my wardrobe, breathing hard. The fear was still there, pulsing in my throat. But for the first time, the desire to stay was louder. I zipped the suitcase shut, empty now, and shoved it into the closet. Then I unzipped it again, just to hear the sound. It was the loudest thing in the room. The GPS voice was calm, polite, and insistent. Turn left in 200 feet. Merge onto the highway. It was the voice of my old life, directing me toward the airport, toward the security line, toward the sterile safety of the executive lounge. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, the leather biting into my palms. The entrance ramp loomed ahead, a concrete vein feeding into the artery of the city. I didn't signal. I didn't check the mirror. I just spun the wheel hard to the right, tires screeching against the asphalt as the car fishtailed slightly, correcting itself onto the gravel service road. The GPS recalculated, then fell silent, defeated by the lack of signal. The silence that filled the car was sudden and absolute, but this time, it didn't terrify me. It felt like the first deep breath I'd taken in years. I didn't drive to the trailhead where we met. I drove to where I knew she would be. She had mentioned a washed-out marker on the North Ridge Trail, a job she needed to finish before the next storm front moved in. The truck climbed the winding road, the engine straining against the incline, dust billowing in the rearview mirror like a smoke signal. I wasn't driving a getaway car anymore. I was driving a battering ram, smashing through the invisible wall that separated my two lives. I found her truck parked at the switchback, muddy and reliable. She was 100 yards up the trail, her back to me. She was driving a new post into the rocky ground, the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the sledgehammer echoing through the trees. I killed the engine and stepped out. The air here was thinner, sharper, smelling of pine resin and sweat. I stood for a moment, just watching her. She had shed the heavy jacket, her arms were bare, muscles cording with every swing of the hammer, skin glistening with exertion. She looked unmovable, driving steel into rock with a rhythm that echoed through the trees. She must have felt eyes on her, or maybe she heard the car door slam, because she stopped mid-swing. She lowered the hammer slowly, leaning it against her thigh, and turned. Her face was shadowed by the brim of her hat, her expression guarded, the professional mask firmly in place. She checked her watch, then looked at me, her gray eyes narrowing. "You're going to miss your flight," she called out. Her voice was flat, carrying across the distance without emotion. "The airport is an hour south. You're driving the wrong way." I started walking toward her. My boots didn't stumble this time. I walked with the purpose of a woman who knew exactly where the North Star was. I canceled it. Rowan went still. The wind rustled the canopy above us, a soft applause of leaves, but she didn't move. "You canceled it," she repeated, the words heavy with skepticism. "Why? Did the firm call? Is there a delay?" "No." I stopped 3 feet from her, close enough to smell the sawdust and the musk of her skin, close enough to see the pulse jumping in the hollow of her throat. "I quit. I sent the email from the lodge parking lot." She stared at me, her grip on the hammer tightening until her knuckles were white. "Melanie, you're reacting to the storm. You're running on adrenaline. People do this. They survive a scare and think they need to change their whole lives. You don't belong here. You belong in a tower with a view, not in the mud." "I tried the view," I said, my voice steady, matching the low rumble of the forest. "It was lonely. And I tried the mud. I prefer the mud." "You don't know what you're saying." She took a step back, putting space between us, trying to reestablish the boundary she had held so perfectly in the lookout tower. "This isn't a vacation. It's isolation. It's hard work. It's boring days and dangerous nights. You're a VP. You fix companies. You don't fix trail markers." "I don't want to fix companies," I said, stepping into the space she had just vacated. I was chasing her now, pushing against her retreat. "I want to fix myself." And I can't do that back there. And what about us? The question was torn out of her, raw and unguarded. The mask slipped. You stay here and what? You haunt my station? You distract me? I can't have you looking at me the way you did in the tower if you're leaving in a month when the novelty wears off.
I'm not leaving, I whispered.
I reached out, my hand hovering between us. I'm not looking for novelty. I'm looking for the woman who called me unflinching. I'm looking for the only person who ever saw me. Rowan looked at my hand, then up at my face. The conflict in her eyes was a physical thing, desire warring with duty, hope warring with experience. She dropped the hammer. It hit the dirt with a dull thud, a surrender.
You're stubborn, she murmured, shaking her head.
I'm motivated. She let out a breath that sounded like a shudder. Melanie, tell me to go, I challenged her, stepping closer until the heat radiating from her body was a palpable wave. Tell me you don't feel this. Tell me the air in the tower wasn't thick enough to choke on. Tell me to leave, Rowan, and I will get back in that car. She looked at me, her gaze dropping to my lips, scorching and intense. The restraint that had held her back in the storm finally snapped. I can't. She moved then, erasing the last few inches between us. Her hands, rough and coated in dust, framed my face. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask. She claimed. Her mouth crashed onto mine, hungry and desperate, a release of weeks of coiled tension. It wasn't a tentative first kiss. It was a collision. She tasted of coffee and salt, of wildness and want. I wound my arms around her neck, pulling her closer, pressing my body against the solid, unyielding line of hers. Her thumbs dug into my cheekbones, grounding me, holding me there, as if she was afraid I might evaporate. The kiss deepened, becoming slow, sultry, a thorough exploration of a territory we had both been mapping from a distance. The forest floor was solid beneath us, roots and rock and earth, but as her tongue brushed mine and her groan vibrated against my lips, I felt like I was finally, truly learning to fly. 3 months later, the silence isn't scary. It's shared. I traded my corner office for this cabin porch, replacing quarterly reports with the steady rhythm of Rowan's breathing beside me. Watching the sun dip below the tree line, her hand warm and rough in mine, I realize I didn't just find a path in these woods. I found a home. I didn't just find a path in these woods. I found a home. If you're ready to find yours, subscribe.